Hey, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon, whether you're listening on the podcast or you're watching here on YouTube. And today we have a very special guest. I'm very honored to have him to take his time to join us, and that's Jim Semivan. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, thank you. Nice to be here, James.
Yeah, again, I really appreciate your time. But for people listening, they'll probably be familiar with you from your involvement with To the Stars. But just for people listening, can you explain kind of your background? You're a former CIA officer, and then you joined up with To the Stars. So can you give people a little background about yourself? At least let's start with your work with CIA.
Yeah, I joined CIA in 1982. I went in and I worked for the director of science and technology for a couple years, 2 or 3 years. And then I switched over. I was asked to switch over to the Directorate of Operations. Went through all the training, became an ops officer, worked overseas, also in the United States, various places in the U.S., a lot of TDYs overseas. I rose through the ranks, became a senior manager at CIA, and then retired in 2007. Took a little time off and then went back and worked with them part-time for the next 12 years. And it was during that time that I met some people from the Pentagon who were running it was Lou's group that was running the ATIP program. And through John Alexander, actually, I ran into John Alexander at a conference, and Alexander heard my story and my wife's story, and he came to visit us, and then he took the data back to a lab, and this is some stuff that came out of my wife's face. And anyway, long story, that started the connection. Jacques Vallée came out to see me. He was the first one, and then some other people came out to see me, and then I got briefed on 2 or 3 times, and then I met Lou, who I knew of, but I didn't know his last name. I knew it was this Louis, and I didn't know anything else. But anyway, I went down and went into his conference room in the inner corridors of the Pentagon, and I will tell you, anybody who says that Lou didn't work on this program, they're full of shit. I was there. I met everybody. I met all the people that work for him and with him, and on numerous occasions. And so he's the real deal. And then that started that. And then I went out to San Diego to talk to Tom DeLonge, who I did not know, but he had written with A.J. Hartley a book called Secret Machines. And that book had some very interesting data in it that we didn't know whether or not there was a leak of classified information that Tom was getting from his quote unquote advisors. We knew he did have advisors, and they were absolutely real. So I went out, and some other people went out with me, but I met Tom one-on-one. Met him at a hotel. We had a lovely dinner together, and within the first hour, realized right then and there that no, there was no leak of anything. And Tom just put 2 and 2 together. His advisors were very sharp about what they told him and what they couldn't tell him, but he put a lot of the story together, and he absolutely impressed the hell out of me. I was. What the hell do you expect out of a rock star, right? But he was an extremely smart guy, very savvy. And then the next day, we met for lunch again with me, Tom, Hal, and there were 2 other people there who I will not name because I don't think they want to be named. But everybody knows who they are. I mean, if I said their names, you would know them. Very senior people in the community. And they, Tom said, "Why don't you join a company I'm starting?" And then long story short, nobody wanted to, but Tom said, just, lay out the company the way you think it should look if you wanted to do this. And so I wrote down on a cocktail napkin what it should look like. Tom immediately agreed. So Hal and I joined right away with Tom, and then that's how basically TTS started. And then within a week or two, I mean, we get Steve Justice from the Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin Skunk Works came on board, and then Lou. I remember talking to Lou, and when at the Pentagon, and of course Tom didn't know who Lou was, and I couldn't tell him who Lou was, but Lou decided he was going to, resign, and finally, I put Lou together with Tom, and then Lou came on board, and then Chris Mellon came on board. And then we had this big meeting out in Seattle to announce the company, and that's when it all started. So, and that's where we are now. And I believe I still have some of my clearances. I do a little bit of consulting on the side. I still talk to some task force people and what have. They'll call me, ask me a question or something. But by and large, I'm not heavily involved in this anymore. Still have my tentacles in, but not heavily involved.
Yeah. So in the Secret Machines books, what was it that stood out or was particularly interesting?
I don't want to discuss that.
Sure. Understood. They are interesting books for sure. But speaking about Tom, he tells a story that he met this guy named he calls the general at an airport, and they had a discussion, and the guy said something along the lines of, it was the height of the Cold War, and they had found a life form. What do you think when you hear something like that?
I'm always initially skeptical, but I know the general he was talking about, who's a straight up guy, and Tom's a straight up guy. Tom, isn't a dissembler, and he basically he tells you exactly what he hears. He's also very careful about, it's what I really, really liked about him. He's very, very careful about who he talks to, and he doesn't talk out of school all that much. And so I respect him for that. But if the general told him that, and, I'm not one to, I wasn't there. I don't know, what context he said that. There was certainly a possibility, that they discovered a life form after World War II. But again, this goes back to legacy programs, the Air Force, CIA, I'm sure they did have, and I'm sure is still going on today.
Yeah, the Air Force comes up a lot when we hear about these legacy programs, and I guess the CIA as well. I did want to get into the legacy programs with you, actually, because Lou has mentioned the legacy programs, and that they were kind of like the deep programs and even older programs that were unacknowledged regarding UFOs. What's so why are the legacy programs so tough to deal with, navigate, find out about?
Well, I think it's the first issue is, I think everybody should understand that, here's how the government works. In 1947, right after Roswell, and then right after Roswell happened, and then we had these UFO flaps that were going on, and there were a lot of them in the late 40s, early 50s, again in the 60s. So what happens is, everybody looks to the Air Force at that time, to say, well, okay, what are these things? So the Air Force came out right away and said, we don't know. I mean, we don't know what these are, but they're definitely real. No question about it. We pick them up on radar, just like we do today. We pick them up on radar. There are a lot of visual sightings, and they made it very plain. I can't remember what's a Twining memo. You remember the Twining memo? Where, yeah. I mean, it came right out and said it. He said, look, we've got to do something about this. We have to start some kind of a program. So they did. And that program was never going to be public. And then when CIA got into the picture in 47 and 48, they also had their own, deal. There was Sign, Grudge, Robertson Panel. You can go down the list, and always looking into this. And what they've always said was UFOs never pose a national security threat. In other words, there's no existential threat to the United States, which they were mostly concerned about. because of Pearl Harbor and World War II. So you have to go back to that mindset. The second thing was they were absolutely right. Our telecommunication system throughout the United States was awful, just really awful. And it's not like it is today. So they were very concerned that they would be overwhelmed. Soviets were very, very good at disinformation and throwing these things out. And they thought maybe this was a ploy by the Soviets to overwhelm our systems. So there are these legitimate reasons, I think, where they looked at this and said, particularly later on in the early 50s, they said, look, we can't have this out in the public because, I don't agree with this, by the way. I'm just telling you what they were thinking. And, Gerald Haynes wrote I thought a pretty good article on this, an unclassified version of CIA's involvement in all this. But I think he was right on the money with it. But what I think goes unsaid is there is no way that the U.S. government, like whether it's the Air Force, CIA, NSA, NRO, is going to ignore unidentified aerial phenomenon ever. They always have to look at this because it is an unknown threat, and you have to look at it as a threat simply because you don't know what it is. If you knew what it was, it's either a threat or it isn't a threat, you would know. So even though they were saying it doesn't seem to pose a threat to the United States, we still have to do that. I think that was the beginning of the legacy programs. And I think also they knew at the time they wanted to divorce themselves, CIA and Air Force at that time. They wanted to divorce themselves from any publicity surrounding this. They didn't want the public to know that they were involved in this because all that did was create more chatter, right, about CIA and the Air Force being involved in CIA. They just wanted to get off the topic, but they still, I think, continued to investigate it on their own. I think that's when the Black program started. I think they continue. I think they continue to this day. Now, as opposed to what they know and what they have, I really don't feel comfortable commenting on that because I don't know for sure. I will tell you though, the educated guess I have is they have some information, but I will bet a year's pension paycheck that they are completely in the dark about what it is. I think this whole phenomenon is well beyond our ken. I just don't think that they know anything more. They may have a lot more information, but they're not going to.
Right.
But anyway, that's so.
And when we're talking about these legacy programs, again, educated guess, how many programs do you think we're talking altogether between Air Force and CIA?
Well, let's expand this. I don't think it's just Air Force and CIA. I think NASA has this. I think NORAD probably has their own. I think the problem with this is, CIA is an interesting organization. CIA is the Central Intelligence Organization. So they're basically in charge. Their charter says they have to go out and they have to interact with other government agencies to get all source information to put a picture together. So and John Ramirez had a wonderful slideshow, and I think he showed it on one of these blogs a year ago or so. But it's a wonderful slideshow where he sort of shows how this happens. Say, for instance, somebody sees something and it looks legitimate. They see some craft in the sky. So what happens? Well, usually what happens is if whoever sees it, whatever government agency sees it, they take it. They make sure they check all their systems, all their radars. Okay, everything's cool. This seems to be real. So then they go out and they'll, in this particular case nowadays, they'll go to the DNI and they'll say, look, we have this data that points to these objects. So the DNI then takes over and he pulls a task force together. And I've seen this happen hundreds of times in all different areas. You pull a task force together from different organizations and then you analyze it. And then once you've analyzed it, you come to the conclusion it's real or it's not real. And then if it is real, then you go back to the DNI and you say, you've got a problem. And you're going to have to brief seniors. So that means, the Department of Defense, usually the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of DOD, you're going to have to brief, the CIA, the head of CIA is going to be briefed, head of NRO is going to be briefed, State Department's going to be briefed. They're all going to get briefed on this. Chief NSA, they're all going to get briefed on this program. And then they're going to have to determine what actions they're going to take. and that's how all intelligence matters, really, particularly big ones, get resolved. So if the Russians come up, for instance, with a new technology, and one small organization in the intelligence community discovers the information, that information goes back. It goes through all these channels. All the analysts get together. You do an all-analyst report, an intelligence assessment, and then determine whether it's real or not. And then once it's real, then you present it to the President, National Security Council, who are the ultimate, consumers, and say, okay, this is your call. Here are the options you can take.
And how have the legacy programs been so well protected?
They, again, well, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'll tell you that after, when Eisenhower talked about the military and industrial complex, he wasn't a happy guy. And the reason he wasn't a happy guy was because pre-World War II, we didn't have any kind of network together. I mean, we were really taken aback. Our Army was woefully ill-equipped. Our Air Force was, it was just not much better than World War I aircraft. And so they realized, that they're going to have to get together to prevent another like Pearl Harbor. They really were going to have to get together and figure out a way to strengthen our armed forces and become more modernized. The only way to do that was to bring in private industry and defense contractors. And the only way to keep defense contractors is by promising them enough money that, and for a longer period of time, so like 5 or 10 years, and say, look, we want you to do R&D. We don't want just, propeller aircraft. We would like you to do, because we knew about sort of jets, maybe in the beginning of World War II. We want you to pursue that too. So that really was the beginning of the military-industrial complex. Now then after the war, when the threat became very, very large and we started bringing over paperclip scientists, I think we brought over like 1,600. It became very apparent that the Germans were working on some incredibly advanced designs, particularly aircraft designs and some other stuff. And then the Russians also were. So what do? You go right to the defense contractors and say, because there wasn't any place else to do it. We didn't have we had Army R&D and Air Force R&D, but woefully too small. And you also needed to get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy to get this done quickly. Reason why the Skunk Works was created for Lockheed Martin. They needed a place. They needed a spy plane. CIA went to them and said, create the spy plane, but we need it now. We need it, So Lockheed Martin said, okay, took a separate chunk out, took all the bureaucratic nonsense out of it and said, design it however the hell you want to design it. And they created the U-2 and, Blackbird and things along those lines. So, it was a good thing, but let me turn back. So and get back to this military industrial complex. So let's say you have something you want to keep quiet, and you have the FOIA, and you have Congress can look at this stuff, or they can call people up and say, in the military and say, I need to know more about this particular program. But if you classify it and turn it into a special access program or special compartmented information, or you have a bigot list, you can only like 10 people are on it or something like that, or 100 people are on it, and then you put it there. Those are usually safeguarded from most members of Congress and the Senate. Now, the Gang of Eight, these senators and congressmen, they pretty much have access to that, and so does Sissy and Hipsy. Sometimes not all of people on Sissy and Hipsy, but usually the directors will have access to that information. So they're fulfilling their obligation to Congress through that. So there's new legislation that's coming out saying like, oh, we're going to get more information. Well, they're going to get more from peripheral agencies, I think like from NORAD and maybe NASA, because NASA is not only a civilian agency, it's a defense agency also. People don't know that, but it's actually, a defense agency. So it has a military component to it. So, they'll get it. But classification programs, the really deep stuff, they're not obligated. They're not going to be obligated to tell everybody in Congress or everybody, in the Senate or what have you. But they are obligated. And they, from what I understand, they do brief people on the National Security Council, the Gang of Eight. And so their obligations are actually met. Yeah. That doesn't mean that the Gang of Eight or the intelligence committees will share that information writ large with other people out there.
Right.
Now, whether that's good or bad, that's. I mean, everybody would like to see more transparency around this issue. But again, I don't really think that the government, any government, really knows what this is, and I don't think they have any kind of understanding of it at all. And the other thing about it is it's absolutely absurd to think that this phenomenon, is centered in the government in some way. That the government is one of the reasons, Tom started TTS and why Lou joined it is because we needed to go private. I briefed some very senior people in the intelligence community telling them we're going private with this because you can't do a damn thing. You can't. I mean, it doesn't belong to you, number one. And number one, it shows up to everybody. It showed up to me. It showed up to lots of people. It showed all around the world. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have experienced it. So it doesn't belong to any government or military. It belongs to everybody. But the military, they claim for national security reasons, and I'm sure there's some that are legitimate. They're not going to be willing to share too much. The Russians want to know what we know. We want to know what the Russians know. The Italians, the British, the Israelis, Canadians. Everybody wants to know what everybody else knows, but you can't really share that information because if you're able to reverse engineer some information on data that you picked up, may not be a crash retrieval or something like that, or it could be, I don't know. But even if just by looking, at some of the data we have on say TikTok, you were able to basically reverse engineer some data. You don't want the Russians to know what you have, what's being developed from that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And just real quick. So are we talking like possibly like a dozen legacy programs or dozens altogether? If you had to take a guess.
I don't think there's that many. I think there might be like 3 or 4 hanging out there someplace.
Okay.
And then they might be, divided up and compartmentalized too into different areas. Don't forget, I mean, when you look at like, say, for instance, what CIA was doing, and I'm not talking out of school here, but the CIA was doing when they were doing MK Ultra, they got into MK Ultra simply because they found out that the Nazis were involved in, mind control or trying to attempt to do mind control back, during the war. So when they realized that the Russians were probably, interested in this too, and they knew that through leaks that the Russians were interested in this, they couldn't ignore it. So they got into, the mind control, psychotropic drugs, things along those lines. It was a totally fucked up program. But what happened was, in the end, MK Ultra was really the basis for looking into the paranormal. We got the remote viewing program, that Hal was involved with at SRI. And that Kit ran for 20 years. Kit Green ran for 20 years. So there was, a lot of intelligence is reactionary. And just because you don't understand what this phenomenon are, if they could pose a threat, you have to look at them. That's why, when that's why you don't hear anything from the Air Force, say, for instance, about UAPs. They're not going to say we don't do anything. Of course they do something. They're just not going to tell you what they're doing. Yeah.
And what might be the scope of some of the legacy programs? I know some people are going to speculate like crash retrievals and things like that.
I don't know. I mean, I would just be guessing how big they are, how small they are. Yeah. But here's the other problem with this. And I mean, for personal experience, if somebody came to me at the agency and said, we heard a particular country has a particular technology that's really far advanced, but we don't know if it's true. So what I would do, I would say, okay, it's gonna let me check. And so I would check in my sources, and I would go out and look around, and let's say I came back and I said, actually, there's a possibility it may be true. But for me to find out, it's going to cost X amount of dollars. So say the Navy came to me and said, But we need to know. So the Navy would give me money, and I would go out and I would create an operation to go out and find out whether this particular technology was real or not. And sometimes it was real, and sometimes it wasn't. Right. And then the next object is, how do I get it? Right. But I don't want to get into that. So I guess the point I'm making is, these things don't go away just because you can't find out. What they do is they get shelved. Because if you run across a problem, like say the UAP problem, and you're looking at data, like some of the Tic Tac data. I mean, you're looking at it and you're going, how the hell do they do 40,000 Gs, the equivalent of 40,000 Gs? This is nothing we have, in our toolbox that could even approach that. And there's so many questions involved in that. There's this precognitive questions. I mean, how did the Tic Tacs know to go to the cap point? Which is highly classified, and it's delivered, verbally to these pilots, top secret. But they knew exactly where these pilots were supposed to meet, right after their missions to protect the fleet. That's very disquieting to an admiral or to a captain. Right, how they knew this. So there's all these other elements involved, and the biological elements. The Gillibrand Amendment talked a lot about that too. It wasn't just nuts and bolts; it's so many other things. So if you're in the government and you're in the Air Force, CIA, NASA, wherever it is, and you're looking at this stuff, I mean, you realize right away, probably within weeks, if not sooner, that wow, this is a lot bigger than physics. And it's a lot bigger than mathematics. It's a lot bigger than engineering. You're really talking about consciousness. You're talking about some elements of quantum mechanics. You're talking about religion. You're talking about a lot of different things, psychology, And go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, just finish that thought, and then I'll ask my next question.
Yeah, and what science does not have, and science has done wonderful things, and it continues to do wonderful things. But what we don't have, and William James, I don't know if you're familiar with him, the father of modern psychology. Yeah. And he talked about this. He said, because he was investigating psychic phenomena back, around the turn of the century,
1900s.
Yeah, and he said, what we really need is a radical empiricism, a radical science. Is a way to take these anomalous behaviors or these anomalies that you see, these 40 and bunch of data that comes up, and we need to study them, and we need to study them and find out what they actually are. But since there's no predictability or reliability associated with them, you can't experiment with them. So what you end up, what we should be doing is what Jacques Vallée is doing right now, a lot of field-centric studies, because, how do you study chimpanzees? Well, you can put them in a cage, and look at them that way. But if you want to know how they live in their environment, you have to go to their environment. So what Jacques is basically saying is, if we're going to study UFOs or UAPs, we have to go to the environment where they show up, and then, and really do deep dives on these things. So I think, that's sort of where we are. And I'm sorry, I'm just very discursive here. I get excited when I start talking about this, and I'm sort of rambling. I apologize. But
no, it's great. It's great. I greatly appreciate your thoughts on the subjects. And, everybody's excited about the new language and the new office, the all domain anomaly resolution office. Do you think that approach, and again, with the Gillibrand Amendment, you think any of that is going to kind of pierce the shell of the legacy programs?
Yeah. I mean, I really do. But I'm going to qualify that. And I think, Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo deserve an enormous amount of credit for this, because they worked, the halls of Congress, and they still are working the halls of Congress on this. And, bringing the data, the classified data that I saw, to Congress, and basically saying, you tell us. And of course, once the congressmen and the senators see this, they realize this is all real, and it isn't ours, and it isn't Russian, and it's not Chinese. So it doesn't leave many possibilities, right? So the door's open. It's definitely not going away. I mean, there's no way you're going to be able to sit on this. Anybody's going to be able to sit on this. That said, the new, when you read the legislation that's coming out, there's always these little codicils in there or little paragraphs saying, yeah, but we're going to protect the national security data and what have you. A lot of information could fall under that. Right. A lot of information can fall under that. So, well, let me give you an example. I mean, if you had a defense contract that was working on, say, something associated with UAPs, and whatever it might be, something nuts and bolts, something psychological or what have you. The mere fact that a private organization is working on that with private citizens, working on that, even though it's a military contract or an agency contract or something, you can't make that public. You can't expose that company to and say, well, yeah, I mean, here's a defense contractor who's working on this aspect. We can't tell you what it is, but this is a defense contractor that's working on it. And they can't do that. You can't do that because that opens the defense contractor up to, commercial espionage, foreign espionage. It could alter their stock price, right. If some people thought it was all crazy. So there's all kinds of, private confidentiality things you have to take into effect. Also, the idea that if you did that enough times, a good intelligence analyst can look at that and actually start putting pieces together and come up with, this is how the intelligence community works. And you get these little individual pieces of information, humant, nascent, geoint, and you put them all together and you go, so that's what they're doing. And you start connecting the dots, and then you come up with a pretty good idea of what they have in their program. And I think that's one of the problems associated with this. So I don't think it's because these programs deliberately want to hide. Where you have a nefarious cabal in there saying, no, we're never going to tell the American people. They don't deserve to know. I think it all comes down to tell your friends, tell your enemies. So I think they're trying to find a way, to go get around that in some way. And maybe they can. I hope they can. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that even people within those kind of programs would maybe even want to cooperate with something like that?
No, individually you can't do that. Individually you can't make up your mind to say you're working for a program and you're working for a defense contractor and you said, yeah, I think people should know about this. I'm going to be a whistleblower and I'm going to go out. You can't do that. You sign it. You sign an agreement. You have top secret clearances or sign an NDAs. And, you owe that. And because here's what the problem is. You get guys like Snowden and this other clown Schulte from CIA who came out and dropped all this information. They think they did the world a big favor. And what they did was cost the government billions of dollars in research and R&D because they decided, at their level, at their 2,000 foot level, that they were going to, correct the wrong, for instance. But yet they're not at that 30,000 foot level looking below and saying, well, reason why we're doing this is because X, Y, and Z. And yes, it has been briefed by Congress. And we can't tell the American people because if we tell the American people, we're going to be telling all our friends, all our enemies what we're doing. So you got to be really, really careful with all this kind of stuff. And it's not perfect. It really isn't perfect. And there are some things, I'm glad the Pentagon Papers came out, for instance, but some of this other stuff, I don't know. What if you had information, say, for instance, one of these agencies had information that was really shattering psychologically or could be considered psychologically shattering. Yeah. Yeah. And let's just say guys like you and me who sort of had experience with this. All right, we'll take it. Yeah, okay. And it might be disturbing, very disquieting information, but because our background and we're used to it, we're accommodating ourselves to it, our psychological profile is such that we're accepting of it. But most people aren't like that. Yeah. And when we started TTSA back in the day, we had discussions about this all the time. Yeah. Are we sure we want to bring this out? Are we going to scare 8-year-olds? I've had friends of mine who, my daughter wants to know all about UFOs. Can she talk to you about it? And I would say, no, I'm not talking to you about this. What am I going to tell her or him? These little kids, 10, 11 years old. yeah, that there's a force that exists out there that can control our environment, that can put thoughts in your head, that can lie to you, trick you, deceive you, and that you're not in control of your life. Say that to a 12-year-old. I mean, we're already saying it to a certain extent, but right now with Hollywood and everything else and TV, they got that ET version of it. Ouch, these funny little things bopping around, but I don't think that's always the case.
Yeah, and the last question about the legacy programs is just would it be possible they had like a legacy program that involved either contact or UAPs and psychic phenomenon?
Yeah, it'd be possible. Yeah. I would be surprised if they didn't. Right.
For sure. So just getting more, because I could sit here all day and talk with you about every subject under the sun about UAP. But regarding like say the crash retrieval idea, Philip Corso came out with his testimony, I believe in the late 80s, early 90s, talking about crash retrievals acquired and technology and technology transfer. So besides what's suggested in Colonel Corso's book, do you think that there have been technologies that could have been leaked into the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a possibility. The problem with Corso's book is I have no problem believing Corso at all. None.
Right.
The problem with it is I don't think he was responsible for writing the book the way he probably wanted it to be written.
Because of Bill Burns. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot of material that was added in there that made no sense to me when I was reading it.
Yeah.
I think the core story is true. I can't imagine why anybody like that would lie like that. I mean, people do lie, but Corso's psychological profile, and for what I know of him, and he was a well-known character, and people knew him. He was a straight-up guy. So I look at that and I sort of believe his story. Now, is everything in the book true? I don't think so. I think a lot of it was exaggerated. Right. But I think the core story is actually there. So yeah, so, it's a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, the possibility of leaked technologies into the public. And if that were the case, what arenas or what area of technology might have been leaked out into the public?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't comment on that. I mean, I'll tell you, CIA used to do this all the time. I mean, CIA would have a program, and our Google Earth. Google Earth, as John Ramirez likes to point out, was a CIA program. And, we had our own satellites up there, looking at the Earth. And this was, and it was an older technology for us. But we're civic minded. I mean, these intelligence agencies looked at this and said, well, we're just not going to, throw this technology away. So we gave it to, well, now it's Maxar Technologies, and they license it to Google Earth. But Google Earth was a CIA program. Every time a government agency develops a program and it becomes slightly outdated, but it still has commercial applications, that information is given. All right, it's given out to commercial entities so they can use it, and because it's government money, you know what I mean. So they have a right to do that. And how they do that, I'm not 100% sure. I figure out which company gets it and what have you, but no, I mean, it's, if the government was working on a particular technology and say, for instance, transistors, and they already basically had a technology and then they went, a slightly better technology that outdated that one for military purposes, they would take the old technology and they would filter it in. So I think maybe some of that was happening. Maybe some of the paperclip scientists got us into transistors, things along those lines, fiber optics, and we developed a technology. We were using it, and then we took it a generation ahead. So the older generation was leaked into the commercial sector. Yeah, that's fine. Now, did we get it from aircraft? I mean, did we get it from a flying saucer from Roswell? Maybe.
Yeah, and I'm not sure in your job if you ever dealt with technology acquisition at all, but were you ever involved with recoveries like a crash retrieval or some kind of technology recovery?
I did. I was involved. Most of my career was. I liked, when the agency you can actually develop an expertise, or you can develop a little niche that you could follow. And they usually, if they're good at it, they'll let you do it. And mine was high tech, and I loved high tech and technologies, weird exotic technologies. But no, I had nothing to do with crash retrieval programs or UFOs at all. And I always like to laugh, and people would say, "Well, do you know anything about CIA activities regarding UAPs?" And I said, 30 some years of working for them, I'd never seen a UAP office or UFO office anywhere. And every once in a while you would hear people talk, about things, but there was nothing you can pin down. But yeah, more terrestrial type technologies. Yes, I know quite a bit about them. Well, I did, now I'm sort of outdated, but
yeah. If you had to speculate on like UAP inspired technologies today, what do you think some of those might be?
Well, anti-gravity, for instance, is and space-time metric work, things along those lines. I think those are fusion technology. I think those, have been around a long time, and people are working on those. I think we'll make headway, particularly with fusion technology, and actually sooner rather than later. Anti-gravity, I think they've already proved the concept in a much small scale. They can do that.
Right.
Large scale, I don't know. But when you look at things like stealth fighters and stuff, they were basically completed in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
So. And so you have to look at, well, if that's true, what's on the drawing board now at the Skunk Works, and I remember talking to Steve Justice about it. And of course he doesn't say anything. But I imagine there's some incredibly, exotic technologies that are being worked on right now, by defense contractors, the Air Force, and that are going to really be mind blowing. And they probably will show themselves in the next 5 years, 10 years.
Yeah. Do you think any of the like UAP inspired technology has crossed over to like the communications field?
Yeah, I'm sure. And this is when we first started TTSA, and we were all talking, and a lot of us had the top secret clearances, and so, but we always were very, very careful about sharing information, because I had my own information, and then Lou had his, Chris had his, Steve had his, Hal had his, but we didn't cross. It's because you have a top secret clearance doesn't mean the guy who has a top secret clearance too, you can share data with them. It's all compartmentalized. Right. Unless you have a need to know, you're not going to know. But I remember going up to Steve, and I said, when we were analyzing the Go Fast video before we released it, and then the gimbal, and I said, Steve, what do you think? And he looked at it and he goes, I want to build that, and he's one of the best designers, we have, right? Aeronautical engineers and designers that we have. And he sketched out this really cool looking craft on how he would design it. And, I wanted to put it on a t-shirt right away. We couldn't do it, but it's a picture of it we have hanging somewhere. I don't know where it is, but yeah, he looked at it and he said, this is what it would look like. And he said, but it's going to cost me $50 million just to get the plans done. And actually that was part of the TTSA, believe it or not, part of the TTSA research side of the house. And we were actually going to do that until COVID hit and everything just sort of collapsed, on that angle. Some of our investors just backed away. But you look at that and as Steve said, yeah, I can start a program to do that. I can make this, but it's going to take X amount of, hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's going to do blah, blah, blah. But that can be done. Or I could do the proof of concept cheaper, maybe 50, 60 million, and then hand it over to the military and then have them follow it through. So.
Yeah. And, kind of speaking to the idea of crash retrievals, you're definitely familiar with the Wilson Davis notes by now, the alleged meeting that Dr. Eric Davis had with Admiral Tom Wilson.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that story?
I will not comment on that.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, so moving on. There's a few kind of like a rapid fire kind of insider ideas, right? Because I mean, you're on the inside loop to an extent of what's going on with this. So how do people in your field really look at like the abduction phenomenon or experiences?
Yeah, it's I had an experience, and technically, you can class it as a quote unquote abduction experience. I don't call it that.
Right.
Because I don't know what it is. I mean, I don't, and I think John Mack, the Harvard, psychiatrist summed it up. He said the closest we can get to what this actually is a mystery, and he said I don't think we can actually go farther than that. At least right now, we can't go farther than that, other than saying that it's a mystery. I certainly do believe that this occurs. It happened to me, and if somebody said, how real was it? I would say it's about as real gets. I said, but then again, was it something that was it a memory, or was it was I set up? What I experienced and what I remembered was that was that implanted by whatever these entities are, or this I called it once a non-human technology, because I think that's probably what it is, that make me believe it was this. How the entities looked, and how some of the physical manifestations that occurred. I don't know. I have friends of mine that we look at Chris Bledsoe's experience, probably one of the most dramatic. If you hear him tell the story, it's just absolutely incredible. And if you know the man, this is a guy who's about as straight up, honest, decent human being as you could possibly imagine. I mean, this is just a wonderful, wonderful man. His children, his wife, you can't get any better than this. They're the all-American family. They're just wonderfully good people. And I always look at kids, you know what I mean? It's like if I meet the parents, and I look at the kids, and kids are crapshoot. I don't know if you have any, but I don't have any, but kids are just a crapshoot. Great parents, lousy kids, vice versa. Or sometimes when you have parents that are really, really good, and you look at the kids, and the kids are just, just great. They love each other. They love their parents, think they get along real well. I mean, you look at that and you go, okay, that's a family. Yeah, every family has dysfunctions and what have you, but I just think they're a great all-American family. But when what Chris went through, and I believe every word he tells me, and about this, and not only do I believe every word he tells me, he attracted the attention of a lot of people: DIA, NASA, CIA, other agencies. Everybody wanted to get close to him. Everybody wanted to know as much as information as they possibly can, because his experience it took in not only the classic abduction scenario, because he had missing time, right, where he had no idea what was going on, right, but he also met the entities themselves, and he also met the lady.
Yeah,
and not many people meet the lady. And I think, and the lady is an element in all of this that really hasn't been explored very much. I will tell you that in some circles it's taken very, very seriously, but it hasn't been explored. The Catholic Church looked at it, because a lot of the sightings, Medjugorje, Fatima, Lourdes, they were all the lady appeared. none of the children that saw any of this ever claimed it was the Virgin Mary. It was just the lady. It was just a lady who showed up.
Right.
And I doubt the Virgin Mary had blonde hair and blue eyes. She was Semitic. So, and of course, the lady would lie, and the lady, would scare the living hell out of them, and fire and brimstone sometimes lovely messages. A typical abduction scenario where these beings come to people and they tell them stories. They have a line about the environment and things along those lines, but they're generally there's a trickster element to it. There is a physical, not very nice physical element to it. There's a very strong sexual element to it. It's not, sexual is homoerotic in some cases. And I don't know what the hell you make of that. I have no idea. But these are all strong leitmotifs that run through these abduction scenarios. So I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about them. And then you have the military abductions.
I was just going to ask about that. My labs, military abduction.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who I respect very highly, Melinda Leslie, who was had a very dramatic experience with this. And which, if you hear her story, you can tell, this is, I believe everything she says. I just don't know what the hell to do with it. And the problem with it is you don't know. You don't know. There's no context. There's no place to put it. It's like abduction scenarios. Where the hell do you put that? What branch of science or philosophy or psychology do you put that? It doesn't neatly fit into anything.
Right. Well, and so two things about that is one, which I found really interesting, because somebody that was talking a lot about my labs, again, maybe. I'm sorry about that. Yes, within their own framing of talking about the subject, which might be correct or incorrect, with Stephen Greer, was talking a lot about my labs and his kind of version of what that is. But then what I found extremely interesting was, because we knew Dr. Stephen Greer had inside sources, maybe some good, maybe some bad. But then again, here comes Tom in the Secret Machines books with his own advisors, and the same kind of, story about my labs is coming out. So, when you have both kind of ends of the spectrum talking about it, it's very interesting.
Well, let's look at it this way. Once again, there is you have to be very, very careful, and that's why I don't like to make any kind of determination one way or the other on what's real here. We have a consensus reality we all agree on, right? Because that's how we live our lives. We know, for instance, that our visual spectrum, our hearing spectrum, auditory spectrum, is very limited, right, on the scale. We know that our brain acts as a filter because even though we're all conscious, all the conscious elements that constitute our being here, our breathing, how the brain synapses work to the way we move our hands and things along. When we drive a car, there must be 1,000 different things going on, but we can't really focus on all 1,000 of them, can we? We go crazy. So the brain has a way of filtering all that stuff out and knocking it all down to the basic stuff. So I think when you look at this and you go through, you're looking at it through an anthropocentric view, this human view of, and you're extrapolating it. What could it possibly be? This is religion, right? All these weird things happen, and what do? Well, the only thing you know how is just like, oh, okay, it's been my experience that blah blah blah. So it must be this. So you make up all this stuff and you codify it and you make canon law and this all that kind of nonsense, and well, you really don't know the essence of it, right? So here you are with, the MILAB stuff. And the problem with MILAB stuff that sticks with me is what you have to assume if MILABs are true is just a bridge too far for me. I believe that the experience is accurate. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think that it is, quote unquote, our military doing this. The logistics behind these MILAB abductions would entail military units, tons of money, people changing. I mean, people that work there, I mean, they can't work there forever. You know, you can't like just be this 19-year-old kid, get indoctrinated into this quote unquote MILAB thing, and then you work the thing and go. It doesn't make any sense. There are generals, I mean, you know, colonels, all these captains, infrastructure that would have to be there, military bases, technology that would allow you to do different things. People, you know, were supposedly taken to military installations and things along those lines. People in uniforms, and nobody says anything. I mean, there's no. I mean, where would you do? And it also assumes that there is a extremely corrupt, highly illegal cabal out there doing these things, and for what purpose? In other words, you're being used by our own government for what nefarious purpose? I don't see that. Having worked in the government for 32 years, I mean, you can see something like an MK Ultra, and you know, you can look at that and you can say, yeah, it was a bunch of guys. They got out of hand, and the agency did way out of hand, you know, in the 60s. And it wasn't until the Church Committee in the 70s where a lot of that was exposed, and they put a stop to it. And you know, when I was in the agency, I had every major operation I was involved in, it was a lawyer right next to me. And these guys were no nonsense. I mean, you know, you could not break the laws, you know. Now, overseas, you were doing espionage. You could break a lot of laws. But essentially, you're not killing anybody. You're not going to try to kill anybody. You don't want anybody to get hurt. You're definitely not putting a U.S. citizen in any kind of danger, right? You can't use U.S. citizens like that. And that is throughout the government. So it would be an enormously risky enterprise. It would have to be extraordinarily well hidden. I mean, with an aura of security and over a magnitude greater than the Manhattan Project. And for what purpose? I mean, for what purpose? I mean, you could get volunteers to do what they do to these, you know, people in these MILAB, or you know, supposedly MILAB experiments. So what I think we have to be careful and look at this and say what might be going on is classic abduction experiences with an overlay of military intelligence or something on top of that is basically structured by this, you know, entity or by this phenomenon to mislead and misguide. Now, I could be wrong too, so I'm not, but for me to believe that the U.S. military is somehow involved, there's just too much. There are too many associations. It would be just, to me, physically impossible for them to do that.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's always like a really heated debate, I guess, or you know, it's not so much in the public conversation as much now, but it comes and goes, and it's interesting. You know, some people speculated, oh well, you know, they were trying to gather intelligence from people who were having abductions and experiences, and that's why they were kind of trying to do it, to extract data, information. But again, I guess that was a speculation behind it. Yeah. Is it possible that a foreign intelligence could pull something like that off on an American citizen on homeland?
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, the technology used, and let's say the Havana syndrome, that technology has been around a while. You can create voices inside people's heads.
Electronics.
Now, as far as creating scenarios, false memories, that would probably mean that the technology has advanced considerably since the 70s, when it was first being, experimented with. But the technology used, you can buy it. You can buy the equipment, you know, yourself and do it yourself. It's not that complicated. And essentially, what you're doing is, you know, you're putting these. Well, it depends. I don't want to get into the wave patterns and stuff, but you know, you're trying to read, you know, clear text, you know, inside something. You're trying to listen in, essentially, what it amounts to. And you could do that for all kinds of reasons. So, is there a corporate entity that is doing it? You know, is it a part of corporate espionage? Is it a non-state intelligence network, which Mike Pompeo alluded to during a speech at the State Department a couple of years ago? I don't know. You know, I don't know. I have a pretty good idea who's behind it. but I'm not going to
Yeah.
comment on that. Yeah.
Right. And now, just to I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the experiencer end. So people have probably heard that you were an experiencer. You mentioned it here. Can you talk a little bit about your experience?
No, I don't. I mean, I can talk a little bit about it. I don't get into the details. That's for another time. I promised two people that I wouldn't, that I respect very highly, that I wouldn't get into it. That's one reason, and the second reason is it's still being looked at, and it has some elements to it that are sort of classic, but it also has some elements to it that aren't, and that look like it could be more sinister than we initially thought. But I will tell you, that what I did, my wife and I, we lived in a house that had poltergeist activity, what I would call very tame poltergeist activity. Footsteps. The minute you went to bed, footsteps in the hall. The attic, people in the footsteps in the attic, footsteps outside. Articles, of clothing or shoes being left in weird places, things along those lines. My wife and I being woken up in the middle of the night by cigarette smoke, and it turned out that we figured it was a poltergeist because the people that lived there before us, essentially what had happened was this family lived there. The mother was a heavy smoker, and they had a couple daughters, and she used to every night come in and then smoking a cigarette and then running her hand through their hair at night, and then reading them stories and putting them to bed. Well, every time my wife would go away on a trip, she's a medical professional, she would go away on a trip, she would come back, and sure enough, somebody would sit on the bed, and they would smell a cigarette smoke, and they'd be running their hands over through her hair, And we later found this all out when the family came to visit us one day out of the blue, and it was very upsetting for them to hear these stories. And we also lived it was an old Civil War encampment, and before that, Native American encampment. So, I don't know, but the poltergeist activity was tame compared to some of the stuff that you would see. So I'm sure there was an element of that there. But what was disquieting about our experience was the physical manifestations afterwards. And I had nowhere to go with this. And it wasn't until it was a few days later, I didn't know what to make of it. It was just the most amazing thing I've ever experienced. My wife doesn't remember anything. And although she was affected, very seriously affected by it. But the next day later or 2 days later, I was at work, and I was in a CIA outbuilding, and I had maybe about a dozen people working for me at the time, and I was chasing them home. I remember on a Friday night, and get out of the office, you guys are, and then I explained what had happened to me to one of my guys there, and he was a deep cover guy. He had just come back from the Middle East, and a very smart guy. I knew he had a PhD, and I know he'd written books, and but I didn't know his real name. I had his real name locked in my safe, but I never looked at him, and because I didn't want to know. And I explained this to him because he told me he was going to a UFO conference in Virginia, down in Southern Virginia, and he told me what he thought it was, and I was completely taken aback because I had studied esoterica and in the occult my whole life since I was a kid, 17, 18. My older brother was a huge influence on me in that remark. I mean, my older brother was a very devout Catholic, but he was also a very highly developed spiritually, and so he would turn me on to a lot of things. So I was in the Greek mystery schools, Roman mystery schools, Eleusinian mysteries, Western mysticism, Eastern mysticism, things along those lines, German Romanticism, which has a lot of mysticism involved in it. So this concept, of high strangeness wasn't new to me, but when he explained me what it was, and he wrote down a list of all the books I should read, and they were almost mostly Jacques Vallée, right? So that's what I did. early 90s, maybe 91, 92 when this happened. And then it wasn't until, much later, 2014 maybe, when our full story came out, and it came out to the military, and that's how one thing led to another. And
and not to pry too much, but was there like an entity that you guys saw during the experience?
My wife didn't see anything. I did.
And was it typical of like?
No, they weren't grays. They were definitely not grays, but they were there.
Yeah. Right. And
it's funny. Yeah, I don't even like talking about it because it's. And I remember when Jacques came to my house, and he spent the whole day with us, and it was just a lovely, lovely man. And I said, look, I said, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I'm crazy. I said, but I know what I saw. I said, I'm laying in bed, my eyes open up, and I see these entities. I said, it was as real as me talking to you. And I said, it wasn't like I'm dreaming. I knew what hypnagogic state was. My wife's a psychologist. I knew what hypnagogic state was. I know what liminal states are. I mean, these are concepts that were very familiar to me, but they're definitely not there. I mean, it was not that at all.
Right.
And then, and then there was this other series of stuff that went on. And then next thing you know is, 7 o'clock in the morning, my eyes are just pop open, and I'm like, what the hell? And then there were the physical marks. I mean, and these were not, little tiny things. There's blood, right? So it was like, holy shit. So, but it wasn't until I actually spoke with them and I couldn't identify, when going through the literature, I never was able to identify the type of entities. And it wasn't until I read a Harper's article by Leo Sprinkle, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, I guess he just passed away not too long ago.
Yeah,
where he had a case where these two women had this, saw the same thing I saw. And then Colm Kelleher, a lovely man, explained to me, he named them, for me. And he said, oh, this is who they are. And he said, these are very rare. He said, you only see them, and we've only been seen, I think, 3 times or 4 times in the literature. You can find it. Yeah. So.
Right.
But that's about as far as I'm going to go with that. So, yeah.
Okay. And just a yes or no on this, then. Was there like a telepathic component?
It's interesting you say that. The only was no fear at all. But I was unable to move.
Yeah.
And then there was one element of it where I was standing with my wife, and I felt very strongly something behind me, an entity behind me.
Yeah.
With sort of a, guardian type kind of thing going on. But, in these kind of experiences, and for a lot of your listeners out there who've had these, and I remember Chris Bledsoe, had them too. I mean, you get these, and a lot of people come to some type of accommodation over time period, right? And they look at it and they say, okay, the initial horror of it, rubs off, and then somehow, like for Chris Bledsoe, it morphed into this new way of seeing the world, and he has become a healer. A deeply, deeply spiritual man. He was a deeply religious man, but now he's a deeply spiritual man, which I find much more fascinating. And his love has only grown. Me, on the other hand, not quite. I haven't come to terms with it, and probably because I sort of grew up a little rough and tumble, and it's like I look at this, and it's bad enough we're born on this planet without an instruction booklet, right? You're just left here, and it's like you're looking around and you have no clue why you're here. You have no clue what purpose this is. All you have, I think, is this innate moral or ethical center, I think, which everybody has, except maybe a sociopath or a psychopath. And I think you have that to rely on. You don't want to kill anybody. You don't want to, do anything. You sort of know what's bad and what's not bad. You just sort of feel that innately. It's almost instinctual, like an animal would have instincts. And then that your perceptions are limited. You find that out later on that and then you see things and you don't know what they're all about. And then you're sort of sitting here and you're looking at all this stuff, and you're going, what? It sort of makes me mad. And I was explaining this to Robert Hastings. Remember Robert Hastings? UFOs and nukes.
Yeah.
Great guy. Yeah. Boy, is he a smart guy. I always tell people, if you want to read one seminal book, read UFOs and Nukes. And he has another book out, Confessions, which is just wonderful too. But
he's an experiencer. Yeah.
Yeah, he's an experiencer too. But I always tell him about this. I said, and I was at a conference a few months ago, 6 months ago, out west, and with about 20 of us. And it was a quiet little place with, scholars and everything. When we're talking about this. And I said, it's extremely problematic for me that this phenomenon doesn't introduce itself. It will come to you. It will tease you, cajole you, screw around with your head, tell you wonderful things, lie to you, tell you, that you have a special purpose. And I said, but it doesn't introduce itself to your parents, metaphorically speaking. It doesn't come out. It just doesn't say this is who we are or who it is. And so where does that really leave you? What can you say about it? Now you can again, anthropomorphically speaking, you can make up all this kind of stuff. You can say, like people do about God, about 20 million, Russians died during World War II, 6 million Jews. Where the hell is God? God works in mysterious ways. Exactly. Yeah. We can't hold God accountable to this. He works in mysterious ways. Well, this is the same shit, Yeah. The phenomena isn't telling you shit. And it's like, so I look at this. And so when I get these young kids, that call me and they'll say like, Mr. Semivan, I want to get involved. And I go, no, you don't want to get involved in it. And I said, it's a one-way street. It is a classic wilderness of mirrors. It is Alice's rabbit hole. And I said, you can dive as deep as you want to dive in there. I said, it is fascinating. It's a lot of fun. I said, but you're not going to get anywhere. I said, get a job, save your money,
Yeah. Well, and I think too,
and play with it, right?
If you're somebody who is an experiencer or has an experience, you're pretty much on the ride, man. I mean, you're in for keeps pretty much. It's, kind of hard to turn back afterwards.
Well, yeah, it is. And I'm not saying like, you can tell by the books behind me. I'll just show you around. I mean, there's wall to wall. I read them all. And, it's not that I don't pay attention to it. I can't walk away from it. And most people who have these experiences cannot walk away from it. Right. All I'm saying is don't expect anything. And particularly from the government. The reason we started TTS is because we wanted to figure this out privately, because it is your problem and it's my problem and it's everybody else's problem that had these experiences, and we have to do that. I don't want to rely on the government to tell me. And I've told this to very senior government people. I said, you're never going to come out with this because you don't know what it is and you can't explain it. And this goes back to the sovereignty principle, right? There was this wonderful article that was written by Alexander Wendt, and I can't remember the other gentleman's name, from Ohio State, basically saying, do you really expect the president of the United States to come out and say, well, we discovered that there's an entity out there, or there's some kind of a technology out here. We don't think it's human, but yet it has the ability to control our lives. It knows everything about us. It can lie to us. It can, change our reality at will. He's supposed to, his job is to protect us, right?
Right.
The military's job is to protect us. Well, if he's telling you that, everything's wide open. Religious scholars don't want to religious people, I should say, don't want to go there either, because where's God in all this? I talk about the great chain of being, that old medieval concept that they had, where there was God, the angels, man, and then they would go down the list, chimpanzees, blah, 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 down to the smallest organism. Well, and even though that's been proven to be sort of a very simplistic concept, it was something that it was a tradition. I mean, people believe it to this very day that there is this, taxonomy, where you have this. But if that's the case, well, the phenomena has got to fit in there somewhere. And it sure is hell above us.
Yeah.
And it might be part of something angelic or demonic. I don't really know, or daimonic, as Patrick Harper would say. We don't know where it fits in.
Right. And just actually speaking to that, because I think that's a very relevant conversation. And again, could we even ourselves or as a society define what an angel or demon is? We have the ideas of what is the interpretation of that is, but on a literal level, right? But do you think we're talking about a singular phenomenon or actually phenomena where actually we have these different experiences and activities that could be different intelligences?
I'm from the sort of the John Alexander school. I mean, I saw a presentation he did once, and the last slide he put up was all these different types of psi, right? And then you have UAPs, UFOs, and then you have telekinesis, psychokinetics, you have clairvoyance, remote viewing, you have parasite, a paranormal phenomenon, you have all kinds of stuff. And he had them all sort of grouped there. And his thing is they're probably all related. And I agree. I mean, they all are probably all related. They're all part of something, whether it's extra dimensional, whether it's actually as like Jeff Kripal, the religious scholar, Jeff Kripal and Whitley Strieber wrote a wonderful book called Supernatural about this. And there's probably dozens of quotes in there, which I absolutely love, but they talk about this, and they talk about the idea of this actually being not supernatural, but actually a part of our environment, and that we're just not capable of. Our brains aren't capable of experiencing right now. We may be able to, when our brains evolve a little bit more. And maybe we're seeing people like you, who are slightly maybe more attuned or more developed, that you're picking up on this. People like Melinda, that have a way to see this, but they can't really make sense of it yet. But nevertheless, most people don't have this. I remember Hal telling me once, anybody can do remote viewing. He said, there are some people that are really, really good, like a really good ice skater, right?
Yeah.
And there are some people that can do it, but they're not really that good. Yeah. So, there's Ingo Swann and Joe McGonigal, up top.
Yeah.
And then there's some people down at the bottom, so it's a real thing. And I was actually at CIA when they canceled the program. And I was actually, there was the meeting that was going on when they canceled the program. I was there. And I remember talking to the guy who had it canceled. And he's a good friend of mine, very senior guy in the agency at the time. He goes, I said, oh, and I knew about it. And I said, well, why did you cancel it? And he goes, well, he said, Jim, it's not because it didn't work. It worked. He said, we couldn't explain it. He said, how do we use it as an intelligence in an intelligence assessment? He said, if we didn't know how we got it. So you can't go to the president, or National Security Council and say, yeah, we know the Russians are building this particular submarine and this is what it looks like. And it's over here. And I go, oh, great. Is that a human source? Did you get that from a spy or an asset? Yeah. Did you get that from? No, we got it from some guy who went off on his silver cord, and and he saw this in his mind. You can't do that, So they canceled, and they canceled it after 20 years. So that was a program, they take very, very seriously. Now, did it go away? I doubt it. I mean, I think CIA probably gave it to another intelligence agency to do, which happens all the time, actually. So.
Yeah, and getting to contact and stuff. I've been involved with something called CE5, and when I say CE5, I'm not talking specifically everything that Dr. Greer says or preaches or teaches about it, because actually there was a group in South America in 1974 doing the exact same thing. Similar protocols. Similar methodology, which basically comes down to consciousness and intention, maybe concentration, and whether alone or especially with groups of people coming together to do that kind of work. Similar to what was done recently, actually, at the Monroe Institute. So, what are your thoughts on the idea of, maybe I can say CE5, but really contact and consciousness with UAP?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm of a mixed emotions about it, mixed mind about it. If I think it's fine to engage yourself in that if you're very well tethered to the ground. In other words, if you're psychologically stable and you have a strong, family connections, and you have strong friends, and you have a really strong psychological profile. I think the idea of going out and experimenting and what have you, as long as you can be pulled back, into this familiar territory, you're fine. As an old hippie who's experimented with more drugs than I care to name, before I joined the agency, they had a big problem with me when I came in because of my quote unquote drug problem. But anyway, they took it away. I can tell you that many a times, when people go out experimenting with psychotropic drugs, psychedelic drugs, and I would say, venture most of the time, it's people come back fine if they're with people that are guiding them and what have you. But there are a lot of times they come back broken and they become disassociated. So I would say to you and to your listeners that there are some horror stories about the remote viewing program, which I won't get into, but you have to be very, very careful when you do that. We know one of the things we do know, there are certain variables, that you sort of pick up as truisms when you talk about this. And we do know that meditation and intention, is like you said, can attract this phenomenon.
Yeah.
But the only issue is, I like to view the phenomena through the light of the jinn, because the jinn are essentially, people made of, plasma type kind of fire, with the Arabic culture. We'll talk about it, but they're known to be, to share some of the human characteristics in the sense that they're emotional, and they can be tricksters. They can be, some are not very nice and some are very, very nice, and all this kind of stuff. So I have to look at it like that. So, but when you're going out into that unknown, undiscovered country, as Shakespeare said, and you're having these experiences and you come close to it or you attract it, you don't have any control of what you're attracting. You can go out with the best interests, the most pure thoughts, and attract something that maybe is going to be very good for you or very healthy for you, psychologically or physically. The proof of that is in Skinwalker. There's Skinwalker classified and there's Skinwalker unclassified. But let me tell you, I saw, some of the effects of Skinwalker on some of these guys, my friends. Not good at all. And both psychologically and physically. When you use a Ouija board, when you get into any kind of a trance, particularly with a lot of people, and you attract something, it could be a neutral kind of thing. It could be fun, but sometimes it's not fun. And so I always say, just proceed with caution.
Yeah, and I'm actually writing an article on what we call sometimes contact work, because I think it's important. I think it's important actually to reframe it, especially with what's going on now, and kind of again another framework to look at it. And then again, in the article, I'm actually going to include a disclaimer, kind of touching on some of the elements that you did. But generally speaking, again, and I'm not speaking about Skinwalker in this way. I'm talking more about the contact work where groups of people go out with, again, positive intentions. A lot of times it seems the contact seems to reflect the individuals participating. Usually, and this is why I think a disclaimer is needed in a mature conversation about contact, is that if generally when people get together that are, of a sound mind and go out with positive intentions, they usually have what can be considered a positive contact experience. Whether they're ready for it or not, right? And how that's going to affect them. That's another part of the conversation story. But I will say that generally speaking, the contact seems to be at least benign or positive when your intention is kind of clear and again, if we can use the word pure, it seems to be reflective in that way.
Actually, there's a body of thought that talks about that is indeed reflective, and that good attracts good, evil attracts evil, and what have you. My point in all this is, though, it's, as a CIA officer, when I would do an operation, and the operation involved dangerous activity, and I consider contact dangerous activity because you don't know what you're walking into. You just don't. You have no idea what this is. And though, to me, it's always like the 80% factor. If I can say to my boss, I have an 80% chance of success that I am going to, accomplish my mission and come back, without anybody getting killed or hurt or anything like that, and nobody knowing we did what we did, I'm willing to give that a shot.
Yeah.
But I think in this particular case, in these cases, it could be 50-50. Sometimes it's 60-40. I don't know. But I just said, I always say proceed with caution. And let me tell you something else. I mean, I some of the serious researchers that I've spoken to at a classified level are very wary of contact. And like I said, you hear some horror stories, and so for amateurs that are out there that are, again, not tethered to the ground very well and are trying to do this on their own, I always say, just proceed with caution. And and the other thing is, what do you expect to get out of this? I mean, if you know anything about mysticism or Christian mysticism or Eastern mysticism, these monks and priests and nuns would devote their lives to achieving a place where they were able to touch what they would consider the divine momentarily. None of it was ever like constant, right? I mean, there have been some gurus that supposedly who live in a sense of enlightenment, but where they're in touch with the divine, or they understand the divine and the divine comes into them. But they really don't know what that is. All they know it's about love, right? And they know it's out there. It's about love. But if you can expect, if that's what you're expecting, and you want to try that, I think it's a noble cause. But if you go in there not knowing, what you want, and inviting something, something to come into you, there's quite a bit of, I'm not, like I said, I'm not a religious person, but there's this wonderful book that was written called Hostage to the Devil. And it was written by Father Malachi Martin. You may or not heard of him. He passed away a long time ago, but he was a Jesuit, a couple of PhDs, and rumor had it that he was in charge of the Vatican's intel service, and what they would call their intel service. But he had the Pope allowed him to, they take vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and the Pope allowed him to sort of less resign, but he had to keep chastity and poverty. He had to keep those two vows, but he was able to disavow, obedience. But he wrote a number of books. But he wrote a book called Hostage to the Devil. There is a very bright Jesuits, extremely bright people. So but that book scared the living hell out of me. I mean, I could read a chapter at a time, and I would go back to it once a month. It was so scary. But he talked about possession, and he talked about the concept and the idea of possession, and everything from sort of minor things of possession to what they call perfect possession or full possession, and what that actually entails. And, you know, even though he talked about it in the guise of religious dogma, what he was really talking about was entities that are invited in. And once they're invited in, you know, sometimes it takes a hell of a lot to get rid of them. And sometimes if you accept what they offer, you're not going to get rid of it. They actually take over. So, you know, do I believe that? Yeah, to a certain extent, but I believe it enough not to try it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but and just for clarity, to the contact work is less about inviting entities in, but more for an interaction. But again, right, I understand the caution and kind of you're not sure what you're going to get, right? But I actually forgot to ask you before. You had alluded to an experience or study that you may have been a part of. Is there anything you can say about that?
No, it's a study. A study started a while back before I was involved in it. My wife and I were involved in it. It's grown a little bit. It was smaller. It involves it's a good deal of it is medical, psychological, and biological. DNA is being studied. Physical characteristics. By the end, medical issues associated with it. The people that are involved are initially it was former CIA, DIA, JSOC, and I think some FBI officers, usually at a senior level, who ran into this or had experiences like this. And then, so they're studying, you know, the commonalities, different commonalities. The problem with it is it sounds fascinating, but it's sort of sad. We've lost some people. And this is why I offer caution, many through suicide. The whole concept of contagion. I know that Skinwalker, Colin Kelleher talks about it.
Hitchhiker effect.
And George Knapp, who's this wonderful guy, talk about it. You know, it sounds interesting, but it's not. I mean, it's frightening to a lot of people. And once again, you know, if you're walking into an area like Skinwalker, where clearly the elements that are there, whether you want to call them elementals or what have you, these aren't naturally friendly types, you know, where you have your typical poltergeist, you know, or ghost or something like that, maybe throwing stuff around or maybe moving things around. Ha ha ha, funny. But there's an aspect to it that I've seen that is not funny, and it is, you know, very, very. As a matter of fact, we were asked why my wife and I seem to be the healthiest people in the group, even though my wife has suffered, you know, some medical issues. Psychologically, we seem to be okay, but you know, it's you know, and I hate to sound like I'm overly pessimistic or something. I'm not, but you know, I'm almost 70 years old. I'll be 70 in a couple of weeks. I mean, it's like what I've seen. I just tell people just be very, very careful and, you know, proceed with caution. If you read John Keel, and, you know, Keel will tell you exactly that. I mean, Keel in, I think it was Operation Trojan Horse, basically believed this is all just a cosmic put on. I mean, this is just a big effing joke by this phenomenon on us. And,
well, again, and I think it's important that, you know, whether we agree or disagree, that we have these mature conversations about it and can take in other people's perspectives. You know, hopefully try to have a mature conversation about it.
I agree. But at the same time, you got, like I say, you look at a guy like Chris Bledsoe. To him, this is all about love. You know, about love, I guess.
And the interesting thing about Christopher Bledsoe and the family is there's been some healings too. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some of them. I mean, I know some of the people he's healed. I look at him as a healer. I mean, no question that in his particular instance, he was cured of a very debilitating disease that probably would have killed him, and yet given a gift. And yet in the beginning, it was horrifically terrifying.
Right.
And it morphed into this whole completely, different thing. Now, did he choose? I mean, did he make the conscious decision to, take lemons and turn them into lemonade, which is the kind of guy he is actually anyway. So, or did the entities themselves, quote unquote, good entities, and basically gave him a blessing as opposed to a curse? My point in all of this is I know specifically, factually, people who have been cursed, capital C, by this.
Yeah. And
we have no idea how. So I'm saying, so people proceed with caution, and I'm not, I remember Stephen Greer, talked about, TTS, TTSA as being this, we're poo-pooing, saying the aliens are bad. No, we're not. Absolutely not. I mean, we're basically saying the military needs to be involved, because until we know exactly what it is, it's, that's their job, right? Protect the United States. So it's a national security concern. Does everybody in TTS, believe that the entities are bad? Absolutely not. I mean, we think that probably, if they've been around since prehistory, right? And, they would have wiped us out by then if they were that bad. So it's not an existential issue, right? But nevertheless, I mean, we may not be equipped psychologically and mentally to deal with that kind of power that comes into you when you have that. And that's all I'm saying,
Yeah. Yeah. And regarding the study that you were part of, is that a private study or is it a governmental study?
It was both for a while. I'm not sure. Well, I think it's probably both now.
Yeah. And I mean, is it, what makes it a governmental and or private study? Like, what is it? Is it just that the funding determines that, or is it the
funding always determines it? There are aspects to it that are funded privately, and there are aspects that are funded publicly.
Right. And as part of it, I guess, private/government because operationally?
No, actually, the reason why it's private, and the reason why it's it's not classified so much as it's HIPAA restricted.
Correct.
So I mean, there are papers being written on it now. That will become public. I'm sure, and but they're not. But the authors may be public, but you'll never know who the people that were involved.
Right.
Or because of HIPAA,
And is that something just that you and other people are working on, or is To the Stars actually involved with that?
No, To the Stars isn't involved with that at all.
Okay.
And I'm not involved in it at all, except as it's being a very peripheral member of it, and what have you. But no, our only involvement with the government and TTS is with the Army Futures Command. We have a credo with them, and we have a piece of a purported UFO material from a crash. I can tell you that the military visited us twice, came to our offices, and both times were pretty impressed with what it was. They're studying it now. They're studying it now in concert with a defense contractor, trying to mimic some of the characteristics of it, as sort of like what Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan are doing with their materials that they found, with Diana, where the isotopic ratios are not of this planet. But again, what the hell do you do with it? I mean, how did these things, they're not natural in any way, shape, or form, but yet they're here. Our piece is definitely manufactured, no question at all.
And is is it known publicly where that piece came from? What crash? What
No, the problem, here again, and I think this is deliberate on the phenomenon side. You got these pieces, and the provenance is very hard. I mean, we know where it came from. We know it came from a guy who picked it up, gave it to his son, who gave it to his son, who basically gave it to Long John Nebel, who gave it to Art Bell, who gave it to Linda Moulton Howe, who sold it to us. So you can look at that and you can say, yeah, but as far as like taking it into a court of law, the chain of acquisition there is. It's nothing. It's not the least bit scientific. It would be thrown out in a court. So to us, we wholeheartedly admit that in the end, you don't know where the hell the thing came from, but we definitely know it's manufactured, and we definitely know it's been looked at by national labs, and every one of them said it would take an enormous amount of money, and we don't even think we'd have the time. In other words, we don't think there's enough time. 100 years, maybe get to this capacity. I mean, to get to this point where we can make it. Oh, yeah, it is really, really odd piece.
And this is the layered bismuth.
Magnesium, bismuth, magnesium. 83 separate layers, and there's some elements we don't like to talk about how it functions. It functions as a waveguide at the micro level. It reportedly has the ability to lose mass once you put energy into it, certain amounts of energy into it. But if you're looking at it, and the military is looking at it so many different ways. That they're looking at it for their own benefit, right? So if they come back and say, "Look," and what I think is going to happen is they're going to come back and say, "We don't know what the hell to do with this. We just don't."
Yeah.
So we're going to put it on a table. We're going to come back and revisit it once our technology gets better, and then we can come back and look at it. And by the way, this is what happens in these programs, these legacy programs. You get something, and you look at it, and maybe say you have a downcraft, or maybe you have a piece of something, and you work for 5 years, and you spend $50 million, $100 million trying to figure out what it is, and you make zero headway. What do? Budget comes around, and your budgets are very tight. Congress comes up, and maybe the Gang of Eight or somebody comes back and said, "What progress have you made?" Haven't made any. It's been 10 years. What do you mean you haven't made any? Well, I haven't made any. Well, we're not going to give you $100 million this year. We're going to give you maybe 10 to keep the program going, but you can't make headway. So what these people do is they keep the program going. It's like ATIP. ATIP was a continuation of OSAP.
Yeah.
They had very little money to continue it. They had enough money to continue it, but people were working on this part-time and lose off
jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. And they kept it going on a very, very small budget. And now the budget's gotten much bigger, but I don't know how big that budget is now. I mean, the new organization. And I don't know, I don't know how much, how many people they're putting into this. And, if they're putting all scientists with no background in this, it's going to be a waste of time.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is, it's very reminiscent of the Wilson Davis notes, and even surprisingly, even though Eric Davis is not a supporter much of Lazar, the Lazar story, both accounts talking about how they look at the technology, they work on it for a few years. There's no progress, they get nowhere with it, and they shelve it for a few years. And every 5 to 8 years or whatever, they try to look at it again when there's been some developments in technology and physics and understanding.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what's going on. And I got my head chewed off when I made a comment that I believed Lazar's story, and I believe his story for a couple of reasons. But nevertheless, some people who know much more than I do told me, it's not.
Yeah,
not accurate, but so I don't know. I guess I'll take the hit on that one if that's the case. But
Yeah, and I know Eric is not a huge fan of Lazar at all, but it is funny that there's that similarity, and the time frame as well is very similar. But I did kind of want to ask you kind of an aside question. Your former, I guess, colleague or, ex-CIA officer, John Ramirez, I guess you can say controversially brought into the conversation the idea of DNA and the DNA possibly from Roswell and hybrids. What do you think of that that idea?
Yeah, well, I know that this study's looking into it. So I mean, it's like it's not an odd idea, a strange idea. The thing about John is, I didn't know John in the agency. John told me we had met once. He came to my office once. They were doing a program and they needed something, and he came to my office, and I met him. And I don't remember that, but I do know who he is, and I certainly. I mean, I've spoken to him on the phone, and we haven't met personally yet, but. I think he's a wonderful guy, and he clearly is who he says he is. I know that because I checked him out.
Yeah,
and very, very bright man. And first time I spoke to him, he shared some information with me that he has not gone public with, sort of to solidify his bona fides. The information, as far as I'm concerned, is accurate. How he explained it to me. So he's not a guy that's prone to making things up. I mean, essentially, if he says something, he's basing it on very, very good information that he has himself. But as far as the DNA stuff goes, I know he has his own views about that. I don't know what to say. I didn't have the same information that he had, so I can't say for sure. It's it's a kind of he said, she said kind of thing. Well, while he was in the agency, he ran into certain things, and people told him things. And, but and he told me what they said, but it's just like, I can't verify it. He's just what he told me. Do I believe him? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I can't verify it. I don't know.
Yeah. Just some final questions. Is there anything coming up from To the Stars? Any books that are going to come out or projects? I know we know that Secret Machines, the fiction version, has some kind of adaptation that's going to be maybe a TV series or something like that. But is there anything in developments with To the Stars?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we have at any given time we have about more than a dozen projects that are going on. Legendary Pictures, the one who did Dune, bought the rights to Secret Machines, as you said. Yeah. So that we're looking at either a television series or maybe a television movie. We're not really sure yet. They've got a couple years to decide what they want to do. They're a great organization. We're really happy that they picked it up. We also have some animated series that have nothing to do with UFOs or UAPs that we've sold, and they're in pre-production right now. Tom's movie, Manchester, California, young adult kind of movie, which is very good. And I've seen the movie, and we're looking at distributors right now, and we're in discussions with them. We're working on a couple other projects, ones that involved HAL. And remote viewing, and then we have our thing with the Army, and we probably have about 6 other really cool treatments. We've already hired some, really first-rate screenwriters to write them, and we're working with Cartel Productions and some other companies to get them out.
I'm sorry, the thing with HAL and remote viewing, I've never heard about that.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said it.
Is it going to be in the public?
But it's really cool, and a script was written by a really talented guy who's done some major Hollywood work, and he's very excited about it. We're very excited about it, and we're working on the funding for it now, so getting that out. But the main goal right now of TTS, we had to switch over to become an entertainment company, because when the pandemic hit, everything went to crap. All of these, we had a pretty good shot at some really good investment money coming in, and our goal was, we were always doing entertainment, but we wanted to do the research side of it also. But the research side was so money intensive, and the money, some of the investors, who walked away during the pandemic, that was where the money was going to go. So we're left with what the Army has. Now we still have that, like we have Scout and Vault. Those are completely done. I mean, those are set up.
They're going to come out to the public?
Well, they're ready to roll, but the problem is, they're all developed, and we have some really sophisticated, AI software that is really behind all this stuff. But when we were working with Microsoft and Amazon about running the cloud structure for it, because it was going to be interactive. And we're going to take stuff in from people. He's like, "Here, send me your video, and we'll run it through our database, and we can tell you with pretty high degree of certainty whether it's real or not real."
Right.
And then we were going to have another interactive database too, looking at that, and we were going to throw in all kind of stuff from MUFON. We were working with MUFON, but the problem was the amount of money it costs to actually run these databases is in the millions of dollars a year. Yeah. And so we need we need that kind of funding, and the only way we figured out we were going to get that kind of funding is if and get our shareholders. We have a lot of shareholders, like 4,000 shareholders. We owe them, first and foremost, the return on their dollar. That's the first thing, and the second thing we owe them, and I think just as importantly, is some progress on UAP, right?
Yeah.
And because that's like, to me, that's the deal, and the only way to do that, the only way to get all these projects going is by making money. And we figured the best way to make money is through entertainment. So that's the quickest return. So we're doing as much as we can to pull money in, and hopefully more investors. Once more investors comes in, and if we get on maybe one of the exchanges like NASDAQ, then the shares become fungible, they become worth something, and then they become traded, and then there's more investors who become interested. And we're hoping that will push everything forward, and we can move forward. Now, in the meantime, we still are talking with other government. We have our hands in, and there's been some opportunities, but we turned down. This wasn't our deal, but I'm very, very excited for the future. I mean, I really am, and we still want to be, the place, the central focus for this topic. We think we have a chance of being that, and not to denigrate MUFON or some of these other organizations, which are fantastic, but we would work in concert with them. I mean, that's the goal, is working together as a team, each one individually going out and doing what they need to be doing, but maybe having TTS focus almost as a central focusing group for this, and running this thing through our databases, our platforms, which are very sophisticated, but we need a lot of money to run these things out. And it's a place where people can come and it's almost like the Black Vault. Jonathan, I can't remember his last name, Greenwald or something like that.
Yeah, John Greenwald.
An incredible thing that he's done. How do you take all this data and put it together? This is what Bass was trying to do, what Bigelow was trying to do. This is now what the UAP task force is trying to do. How do you take all this data? Now, Jacques, Jacques Vallée actually built the data programs, the data processing. Yeah, and of course he's one of the best. So he's one of the world's best at this, and that's what their goal is. But of course, hopefully they'll have the money to do this if they get a contract. I'm not sure if they have or not, but I know some places have gotten contracts already from the task force. And I'm sure that's what they're going to be doing, because the only way you're going to get to this is find some type of pattern, within the noise. And then, because right now there's a bunch of dots, and people say, well, we have to figure out how to connect them. Well, I'm like, we don't even know what the hell the dots are. I mean, we think they're the dots, but we don't know if that's really what we should be looking at. I mean, let alone connecting them. I mean, all we got are these big areas like psychokinesis, but we don't even know what the hell psychokinesis is. We can tell you what it does, but we don't know how it works. So that's sort of what the problem is. There's no there. There's no ontology that we have. Yeah.
And do you think once there are possibly some developments and kind of refining the perspective on that it will become public as it's happening?
I think, yeah. Well, let me put it this way. Don't hold your breath on the government.
Right.
coming out with anything beyond more videos, maybe. I think it's unfair to put it on the government, like, Lou's program and James Lukatsky's program. He was the guy who ran OSAP. Incredibly nice guy. I've never personally met him, but I had an email conversation with him once. They were the ones who really got the ball rolling. They knew it wasn't nuts and bolts. It was a lot more than nuts and bolts. You got to look at Bob Bigelow and his group Calm and all these guys. These are the guys that really, George Knapp, they made it happen. They really sort of started this whole thing. Lou walks in, did God's work as far as I was concerned, keeping it all together and then pushing that out there. He's a hero in my book. And so I think the cat's out of the bag. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be out there. But if you really want to get to the heart of this and you really want to know, it's got to be private. It's got to come from the private. And then I was at a conference and they had asked me so I wrote up a little thing. This is what it's got to look like. You can't have this, quarterly, reviews, which, is we getting anything for our money? You can't do that. You just have to throw money at it, and you have to keep throwing money at it. It might be for 10, 15, 20 years until you can get something that you can work with. And it has to be something where everybody's involved, where other governments are involved, where religious scholars are involved, social science teachers, philosophers, scientists, researchers like yourself, experiencers who are all involved and all participating in this and trying to work together. That all sounds kumbaya, but honest to God, it can be done. I've done this before myself inside the government at a classified level on big programs. So I know it can be done. It's just a lot of hard work, but it can be done.
Yeah. Yeah. And, actually, I know that Peter Levenda, and Tom have the other book coming out, War, out of the God's Man.
Yeah. I read the unfinished manuscript. Great. Levenda is he's just a smart man. He and Tom, would get together and they were talking. For this third book, I talked with Peter a lot too about where it was going. And I know AJ is working on the third installment of Secret Machines. And we had talked a little bit about where, it was going to go. So we're really, really looking forward to those things coming out, and hopefully they'll be coming out soon. So.
Yeah, and I encourage everybody to go listen to the To the Stars podcast, because your talks with Peter Levenda are incredible. They're some of my favorite talks.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm hoping I can get Peter Levenda on here.
I'll talk to him. I'll talk to him. No problem.
Yeah. A great thinker. And I always appreciate his perspective. And again, as I said, his sourcing. You look at a Peter Levenda book and you have research for the next few months. It could be years if you look at all the sources in his books and go back to the sources and look at them. They're immaculate. He's a bona fide historian and religious scholar, and he is an academic, and he takes these things very, very seriously. And this is one of some of the problems with the UFO community, is why a lot of people don't get heavily involved. Like some of the people I hang out with don't get heavily involved in it, is because they'll write books and they'll just say things, but there's no sourcing for any of it. And the reason why there's no sourcing for any of it is there isn't any. And I was listening to a podcast the other day of this. I won't say who she was, but I was just absolutely stunned by the, audacity of this person just making up this stuff out of whole cloth, pulling together different things. It reminded me of, what's his name? The guy who started Werner Erhard, back in the 70s and 80s. You're too young for this guy, but he pulled together, Buddhism and philosophy and everything, made this whole seminar together. And it was just absolute nonsense. But you have to be careful with stuff like that. Yeah. And, Jim, it's been a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate your time. It's a great discussion. I could just keep at this all day, so I don't want to keep you too much longer.